Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I am very pleased to welcome you to the very first Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity seminar of the semester. The Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, in case you don't know, is a research, education, and engagement organization that is focused on the future of cybersecurity. We do lots of research funding here on campus. We host educational programs, and we try to be a neutral platform where nonprofits, governments, industry, and others can come and learn about the future. Today, it is my honor to have Catherine Crump and Andrew Guthrie Ferguson to speak here. So let me introduce you to each of them. Ms. Crump is an assistant clinical professor of law at the UC Berkeley School of Law, as well as director of the Samuelson Law Technology and Public Policy Clinic. She's also co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. I'm very grateful you still have the time to come visit us today. Professor Crump's primary interest is the impact of new technologies on civil liberties, and she has a plethora of experience litigating constitutional matters related to the First and Fourth Amendments. She was a fellow law clerk on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and served as a staff attorney at the ACLU for nearly 9 years. Mr. Ferguson is a professor of law at the David A. Clark School of Law at the University of District of Columbia. Thank you for traveling all the way here to be here. He teaches and writes in the area of criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence. Prior to joining the law faculty, Professor Ferguson worked as a supervising attorney at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. His recently published book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement, examines how surveillance technology and predictive analytics shape modern policing. Today we're going to do something just a little different. Our two esteemed guests will combine forces to engage in a fireside chat discussion around these pertinent topics of surveillance, policing, and civil liberties in an age of big data. But first, they're each going to give a brief presentation on their own research. So we're thrilled to have them both here. Please help me in welcoming both Catherine and Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to talk a bit about the future of big data policing, a future that in many ways has already arrived, about how new technologies are changing where police patrol, who they target, how they investigate, and how it is shaping and shifting our relationship with police and law enforcement across the country. I want to begin by just showing you a quick video. It's a trailer of a documentary film that just came out called Pre-Crime, and it gives you a nice visual of some of the technologies that are at issue in big data policing.
Is really when it took off. The police department came up with more than 400 individuals who were most likely to be prone to violence, either as a victim or a perpetrator. And they were chosen through mathematical algorithms.
A prediction is being made about something an individual has not yet done but is going to do. And a preemptive arrest is made of someone before they performed an act.
That's not quite true.
Wollen wir in eine Gesellschaft geraten, die komplett überwacht ist, wo jeder sein Wort bekommt, so wie es eben die Chinesen vorhaben? Wollen wir in so einer Gesellschaft leben? Und die Frage ist, warum tun wir das?
Who is that good for? Is it good for the streets or is it good for the police?
They haven't told us what the algorithm is that they're using to identify people. There's no way to get off the list once you're on it.
It's the securitization of our society. It's not aiming to a certain future. The future is already in the present right now.
Die Überwachung ist nur und alleine dafür da, in ihre Zukunft steuern und regeln einzugreifen.
This is the new world, and right now, the policymakers haven't really thought through the consequences. They haven't figured out how do privacy laws adapt. And it's important, I think, to ask these questions now.
What about when they got your son? When they got your daughter, your child, when it's you, it don't affect nobody until it come knocking on your door.
think we're at the very beginning of a very big conversation.
As they say, the book is always better than the movie, and I think that might be true here as well. Sorry, now, the technology. Stop technology. How do you get? There we are. It's all right, it's fine. So the book looks at how technology is changing who we police, where we police, how we police, and even sometimes when we police. And I want to just walk through some of how these technologies are actually changing. Take place-based predictive policing. Right now in modern squad cars, police are following a computer map. It's a heat map that shows areas of predicted criminal activity. How do those areas get chosen? It's past crime data that gets crunched to determine whether or not there might be an extra likelihood of a particular crime. It might be the case that you're looking at just simple inputs like type of crime, place, location, or some of the more complicated models add in other things, time of the day of the week. Fridays or paydays, you might see an uptick in robberies. Weather patterns. When it rains, bad guys don't like getting wet. Crime goes down. And so these models change where police are patrolling, how they're patrolling, and how they view their communities. Person-based predictive policing. Right now you saw a little bit in the movie about the heat list in Chicago. Right now an algorithm is determining the most at-risk people in Chicago, people who might be the most at-risk for either being the perpetrator of violence, like the shooter, or the victim of violence, the one being shot. If you make this heat list, you might find a detective on your door, knocking on it with a recognition that they have your name, they have a threat score, and they literally have a letter with your name on it explaining why they think you are most at risk. It is both a measure of social control, we're watching you, but it's also kind of a quasi-public health message, right? This idea that we are recognizing that there are certain risk factors for violence, and maybe we can intervene. The critics say it's just a virtual most wanted list. The supporters say it reduces crime. In addition to people and places, we have groups. Individuals commit crimes in groups. We have gangs. Right now, Palantir, the company that brought you how to track terrorists across the globe, is partnering with LAPD to track gang members across Los Angeles. The idea is that they can look at the associations of people. They can look at the individuals who are connected. Maybe it's a license plate, maybe it's a phone number, maybe it's an address, maybe it's a girlfriend that intersects them. And they'll be able to track these people into groups and be able to look and see who's involved in crime. So all of this policing is being watched, focused surveillance. Right now in Lower Manhattan, there are 9,000 linked video cameras that are watching, feeding back into a central control center. They're able to watch you as you go from corner to corner through the financial district. If they want to see if there are particular patterns, they can actually scroll to find all of the people wearing giant shirts at times. They have automated prompts that can read the license plates to be able to tell which cars are coming through, and automated prompts to see if they see something suspicious. Someone puts down a bag and walks away. The cameras pan to see if it's an absent-minded tourist or an evil-minded terrorist. The idea being that this focused surveillance gives them an ability to track individuals in an area they think is at risk. Mass surveillance technologies, the idea of being able to use technologies that can watch entire populations. In Baltimore, there was a private company called Persistent Surveillance Systems. It was basically, if you can picture it, a Cessna plane outfitted with the cameras that belong in Afghanistan and Iraq. Literally can videotape entire portions of the city in real time. They called it a TiVo, where they could go back and watch. And what they were doing was they were listening to the radio runs of the police. So they'd hear that, okay, there's an armed robbery or a bank robbery at 4th and Elm. And they could go back and watch the bank. The guys getting out of the bank, getting to their car, driving where they were going. The problem was they hadn't told the city council or the mayor or anyone else that they were doing this. And yet, while very valuable, as you might imagine, for Baltimore Police Department, it was shut down as soon as Bloomberg News revealed that this was going on in terms of this mass surveillance. We're all part of it, right? In addition to being able to visually watch it, we're being tracked by our digital trails, our sensors, right? Those smartphones in your pocket know that you are right here. All those people twittering right now, you're being watched and you're being seen. That you've come to this lecture of all times in the middle of the day, you're clearly going to be targeted for some extra surveillance in the future. You already live in Berkeley. It's probably enough right there. But, you know, you have enough that we're able to be tracked where we go based on our own sensors that are pretty much being built into the fabric of our cities and our society. And we're doing it ourselves. You know, it used to be if you were a cop and you wanted to watch someone and track someone, you had to sit in a hot car and drink cold coffee and watch where they went. Now people leave their smart homes, get into their smart cars with their Fitbits and their smart heart stents, and the digital trails are just so revealing that you can watch where people go. It's going to radically change how police do their jobs, how they can investigate, and how they can sort of track people across the world. And we're doing it ourselves, right? There are now gangs tweeting out threats on Twitter. There are people who are videotaping themselves and posting it on YouTube. There are entire detective squads that now are devoted to watching young people do dumb things on YouTube as part of their gang associations, right? This is the change of policing. And it matters because those associations become part of criminal conspiracies that become part of big criminal prosecutions and lock people up for long times in jail. And of course, we have all of our traditional criminal justice data that we've always collected, right? All of our records and arrests and contacts, our biometrics, our DNA, our iris scans, our tattoos, and everything else that's now being collected in big databases that allow for lots of tracking and surveillance, and really an ease of prosecution we've never had before. So I wrote this book to sort of talk about this fragmented world because in many ways these stories, everything I talked about is real. Everything is happening somewhere in America today, but it's not happening everywhere at once. And so this fragmented story I tried to put together in this book to tell a national warning, to say that we really need to be starting to think about these issues in a way to pay attention to how policing is changing, how surveillance is changing, how we work. And so, you know, the theory of the book, and we don't have much time, but it goes into it, basically says, look, the reason we're here today is for three reasons. One is technology. We're able to do things we never were able to do before. We have big data capabilities that can look through unstructured data in ways we've never been able to do before. We have digital trails that are revealing things we never could see before. And the technology has now come to a level of maturity, even though we're still in the infancy, that is going to change how police see their worlds. But there are also other pressures, right? If you trace the history of big data policing, you'll see it comes out of the recession. It comes out of a recognition that with, you know, lower taxes in your states, federal sequestration, there wasn't money for police officers to hire more police officers. So what did they do? They said, you know what, we can do the same thing with better technology. We got this new black box that's going to fix our problems, and that's really been a way where police have moved forward. And you also have the reality of race in America, right? In Ferguson, in Baltimore, in Staten Island, and almost everywhere else, the reality of racial tension has grown where what people have always known has been there, has been even more at the forefront. And so what do police do? They want to say, don't worry, we're going to change that human drama, that human dynamic, and change it to follow the data. It's going to be an objective, data-driven policing system, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to move past the racial tension in the past. And of course, not thinking about that the reality of the inputs are the realities of who we, of policing. It's very human and it's very real. And so we have this rise, and the theory of my book is that all big data policing has a black data problem, black data being three related things. One is that there's a transparency problem. We're talking about a black box. We can't see it. Everyone here probably knows what an algorithm is, but the rest of America doesn't. And even when you start talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, you're never going to be able to peer into that black box. It's also black because it's racially encoded. The data is coming from the real world. It's coming from real policing. And all the racial bias we know exists in policing is being laundered through this data. And it's also black because it's distorting. The constitutional rights and responsibilities we have change when there's new data, right? If an area is predicted as a high crime area, is that going to change how police see the people in that area? If someone is on that HE list, does that change how an officer deals with that individual? And all of these are open questions we have to address. I also will talk a little bit later about the ideas about whether we can turn some of these technologies on the police to be able to encourage police accountability, or maybe the problem with predictive policing is the policing part, and we can look at some of these bright data ideas, that is risk identification. The future of policing is happening here, I'm told, next week, where the Berkeley is going to determine whether or not there should be surveillance oversight, and they should. The end chapter of my book is all about why we need to have surveillance summits. It's basically the same idea of having community, local oversight on these kinds of policing technologies, and how we need to think about, this is the last slide, how we need to think about surveillance as a civil rights issue, right? It impacts different communities differently. It impacts people of color in different ways than it does the people who are more privileged in our societies, and we need to think about it that way because we haven't been thinking about that. We think of it as a tech issue, not as a civil rights issue, and we need to recognize that all of this can change if we as citizens care about it. And if we sort of engage like the citizens of Berkeley and like the citizens of Santa Clara and like the citizens of Oakland and like the citizens of Seattle, we can change it if we want to do it. So that's my half-hour talk in 10 minutes or so. That's why I'm speaking so quick. And I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and then we're going to do our Q&A. That one, right?
Right there, yeah.
Present. If you take this one, I'll tell you.
Okay.
Well, hello. So I'm going to be, Andrew's just given you a broad overview, and I'm going to zoom in on one particular aspect of surveillance today, which I've called surveillance policy making by procurement. So I got interested in the topic of police procurement of surveillance technology in a prior life. As Betsy mentioned, I used to be a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union. And one of the things I did in my day-to-day work on surveillance was to file Public Records Act requests to learn what surveillance technologies particular communities had acquired. And I was genuinely surprised how often the results of my Public Records Act request would be the first time that the mayor, the city council, the public would learn that their particular community had acquired a drone or a Stingray or whatever it was. And that got me interested in this topic of how police departments are acquiring surveillance technology and why it often occurs without the public, city councils, elected representatives being aware of it. And so my work draws a parallel between police acquisition of military-grade weapons and equipment and police acquisition of surveillance technology. So this is a photograph of the police response to the protesters in Ferguson after Michael Brown was shot by a police officer. People came out and protested, and members of the public were genuinely surprised to see that police officers had tank-like vehicles, had really substantial weapons, and there was a public response, right? People weren't comfortable necessarily with local police departments having this technology. So the White House conducted a top-to-bottom review. What is the federal government's role in funding this technology or supplying it? And it turned out to be quite substantial. And this review, which then President Obama commissioned, reached a number of conclusions. So it concluded, for example, that although the federal government often funded the acquisition of military-grade equipment or gave away military surplus equipment, that it hadn't put in place training requirements about how to use the equipment safely or how to use it consistently with civil rights and liberty. And it also found that local officials frequently were not involved in the decision-making about what weapons and other equipment to acquire. And one of the things that's so striking about this is that the same thing is true about surveillance equipment. One of the differences, though, is you generally don't end up with pictures like this because you don't see the surveillance equipment. So I'll talk a little bit about what my research found. So the federal government makes substantial amounts of money available to fund surveillance equipment. It's hard to track exactly because the federal government doesn't track it exactly, but these are examples of programs that fund surveillance equipment. One of the things they have in common, they've actually been created to combat terrorism. The State Homeland Security Program, for example, is designed to help localities detect, prevent, prepare for, recover from acts of terrorism. And so there are these large federal grant programs that are geared towards terrorism that make money available for local law enforcement to acquire surveillance technology, because one of the findings of the 9/11 Commission report was that we needed to do a better job of connecting the dots. But none of these programs require local elected officials to be involved in decisions about what surveillance technology to acquire. And none of them require that when you adopt a surveillance technology with federal funds that you put policies in place to govern how it's used, right? So you can get your Stingray paid for by the federal government, but there's no requirement by the same funder that, for example, you have a policy that says under what conditions you'll use it, how long will you keep the data, right? These are basic questions of data management that an audience at the iSchool certainly doesn't need to be told about. And I think this is particularly significant here because of how the United States structures its police departments, right? So in the United States, in contrast to other parts of the world, police is locally controlled, right? Local police departments are locally funded largely, and they report to the local city council. And so we rely on this feedback loop of people complaining about police conduct coming to the city council, and then the city council regulating police departments. But something about this infusion of federal money has broken this cycle down, because local police departments don't seem to be subject to the same level of scrutiny when they're paying for equipment with federal funds than if they have to come to the city council and say, I'd like $3 million, right? The city council says, why, right? What are you going to do, in a way that they don't when the police come and say, the good news, the Department of Homeland Security is going to give us $3 million. So then I started looking more specifically to see if I could understand, like, what's exactly going on here? What specific factors and structures are involved in allowing local governments to acquire surveillance technology without public oversight? So I looked at Seattle's acquisition of a drone and building of a network here, and I know many of you, I can just tell from the audience, were involved in this, Oakland's construction of Domain Awareness Center, and then San Diego's rollout of facial recognition technology. I'll be brief about these, but Seattle acquired a drone, and it did so using part of a grant from the Urban Area Security Initiative. And the police department came to the city council in 2010 and said, we'd like to accept $2 million of federal funding in order to provide terrorism prevention training. And they never disclosed to the city council that some of that money would be used to buy a drone. Then, many years later, the Electronic Frontier Foundation filed a federal FOIA request with the Federal Aviation Administration to get a list of police departments authorized to fly drones. The Seattle Police Department was on the list. The Seattle Times published a story, and it was the first time that the mayor and members of the city council had heard of this, not to mention members of the public. The public outrage was high, even though this drone today almost seems laughable. It looks like something you'd buy for a couple $100 on Amazon, but this was a while ago. And in this case, the Seattle Police Department just hadn't been forthcoming, right? There was another issue in Seattle where Seattle got federal funding, this time from a port security program, to build a mesh network with video cameras. They told members of the public and the city council that the video cameras would be pointed at port facilities in the shoreline. It turned out that the video cameras were actually pointed at residential neighborhoods, which people noticed because they looked up and were like, what is this camera doing looking at my house? In that case, again, the police department in Seattle just hadn't been forthcoming, right? So that's one way this happens, is that police departments just actually don't supply the information to local officials about what they're going to do with the money. Oakland is a different case, right? So Oakland, and I know some of you were involved in the advocacy aftermath of this, accepted $2 million of federal anti-terrorism funding to build a domain awareness center to network together all of the surveillance infrastructure in Oakland. And actually, if you go back through the records and look at it, and Oakland, in great open government move, puts all of its video of all of its city council meetings and even committee hearings on the internet. So if you're really, really bored, you can just go watch the public safety committee meetings, from 2012. The public safety people came to council and they gave a great PowerPoint presentation on this thing was going to do, and they talked about how fantastic it would be to be able to network all this stuff together, and the city council said, fine, sure. It got approved on a consent calendar, right, which meant together with 77 other items, they just voted yes en masse to accept this money. And then 3 years later, the public safety public safety officers came back saying, hey, we want to take a few million more dollars of federal money. And at that point, people watching the live stream at home, and I'm not actually kidding about that, that's actually what happened, noticed that this was happening and said, wow, we're building this multi-million-dollar major surveillance infrastructure in Oakland, and the Oakland Police Department, at that point, the public just wasn't ready to bear it, right? You all live close enough to Oakland, or maybe even live in Oakland, and know that the Oakland Police Department does not have a good reputation for preserving civil rights and liberties. And so, I think if city council, if city staff had really thought about this, they would have realized that ultimately building a massive domain awareness center, while maybe acceptable in New York City, is not the type of thing people in Oakland are going to accept. But it was a fundamentally different problem, right? In this case, the city council was told, they just didn't really understand the significance of what was being constructed. And this third case study I looked at was San Diego. So San Diego got federal money to roll out facial recognition technology. So this again got uncovered by the media years after it was deployed. So police officers in San Diego have tablets or phones, as you can see here, they snap a picture, they can check to see whether someone, it matches a database. In this case, the database is local arrests photos, not, for example, the whole DMV record. In this case, the public was also surprised, but in this case, there was sort of a third way this happened, which is that there is an entity in San Diego called the Automated Regional Justice Information Center, which is embedded in something called SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, right? And so this entity received a federal grant. They developed the technology. They rolled out the technology. And the process was in some ways just not transparent in that although SANDAG has public meetings, no one goes because no one has ever heard of SANDAG. I don't know how many people in this room have heard of ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. Some of you are nodding your heads, but many of you aren't, right? And so this is sort of one of the key problems with regional governance authorities. So just to wrap up, I think in the end, there end up being multiple different pathways by which police departments acquire surveillance technology. One of the common features in these examples is that really basic things were missed, right? So if you deal with data at all, you generally think about data management. And these systems just didn't have plans in place. What data are we going to collect? How long are we going to keep it? Who are we going to share it with, right? The stuff just got rolled out without any of that being thought through. And that, to me, points to sort of a fundamental governance problem. And my work ends by talking about sort of different solutions, right? Which unfortunately vary in effectiveness and plausibility, right? Theoretical effectiveness and actual plausibility in an inverse way, right? So in theory, the federal government could fix a lot of this. How? Well, if you accept federal funding for surveillance equipment, you could be required, for example, either to at least have a use policy in place and to involve and to present that to the city council, or maybe you could even be mandated to use a specific civil liberty protective one. The Trump administration, I would bet my next paycheck is not going to adopt this as one of its major policy priorities. But what you have seen, and I think has been really great, and I know some of you here have been involved in this, are these these local ordinances, these local surveillance equipment ordinances, starting to try to regulate, saying, hey, police departments, and not just police departments, but city agencies, if you're going to acquire data, right, you have to tell us, the city council or other governance body, in advance, and you have to come with some kind of policy for using this. So Seattle pioneered it in an ordinance that was well-intentioned but ultimately flawed. And now Oakland has been working on this for years. And as Andrew mentioned, and as many of you know, Berkeley next week is going to be considering this at a city council meeting. So I'd be happy to talk more about advocacy strategy behind it later. But that's the overview of my my line of work on this topic.
So I think we're going to segue to our questions, and so how about I will continue to ask you the next question, which is, so if you haven't read Catherine's paper, you should, because it has put her as the national expert on procurement and this issue, but it ended in 2016, right? That's when you published it. So what has happened since that we should be paying attention to on the issue of local procurement of surveillance technology?
Well, so the initial Seattle, there has been this increasing number of local ordinances that people have been pushing for, which is pretty exciting. I like the local approach in part because I feel differently about different police departments. They have their own histories. They have their own level of trustworthiness. So for example, not everyone in this room may agree with me, but I actually have a lot of respect for the Berkeley Police Department, and my willingness to allow them to collect data is higher than how I would feel if I was living someplace where the Oakland Police Department was there. So I like this local approach because it can be tailored. Seattle had an interesting aftermath. The ordinance passed. 2 years after it passed, no police department or any other department had ever come to the city council with a proposal about a new surveillance technology they were going to acquire, and everyone wondered, why is this? Are they not using it? Are they just not coming? Well, it turned out the answer was they just were never coming, and this became controversial when the Seattle Police Department adopted a social media monitoring technology and didn't come to the city council to talk about it. So Seattle has now adopted a more robust ordinance, Oakland, and I know some of you are participants, has this really fantastic Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission. Deirdre Mulligan, a professor at the Information School, is on the commission, and they meet in Oakland about once a month, and they're both working on a surveillance equipment ordinance, and they do these fascinating meetings trying to figure out what policy should govern particular surveillance technologies. And it's a really interesting thing to watch, right? Because there's a member of the commission from every district in Oakland, and some people are privacy advocates, but other people are just sort of, you know, interested citizens. And to watch them try to figure out, like, you know, what to do with mobile cameras is really fascinating, right? So Oakland has a problem with dumping. People come to Oakland and they dump their used materials on the street because it's much cheaper than actually taking it to the dump and paying to have it disposed of properly. So Oakland wants to deal with that. Well, one of the things they did is they got some mobile surveillance cameras to try to catch the people doing the dumping. Well, then this commission had this debate. What about the homeless people who tend to live in the areas, right, where this stuff gets dumped? What about their privacy rights? And so it's just this really interesting democratic experiment in seeing how surveillance technology will be regulated. These ordinances are starting to spread a little bit. Berkeley's considering one. Davis is actually also voting on one next week. And so, you know, I think it's the beginning of something, and it's modest. And of course, it's limited because only jurisdictions most concerned with these issues of civil rights and liberties will tend to adopt them. But I think it is at least an opportunity to see how to write these ordinances and then how to learn from ones that don't work to write them better going forward. So in your book, you talk about the black data problems, and in your presentation, you talked about it at a bit of an abstract level. Could you maybe apply it to one of the particular technologies you discuss and in the book, and let us know how it works out?
So, you know, talking about one particular technology in one particular city, you know, in the video you saw a little bit of the heat list in Chicago, right? Right now in Chicago, there's this algorithmically derived list of people who are most at risk for violence. You might ask, well, how do you get on that list? Well, here are the inputs. Whether you have been arrested for a prior act of violence, a weapons offense or a narcotics offense, whether you've been the victim of a violent offense or crime, your age at the last arrest, younger the age, higher the risk score, and kind of the trend line, whether this is something that is sort of increasing or decreasing. Are you aging out or are you still involved in it? You might ask yourself, how do you get off the list? You don't. You might ask yourself, what happens when you're on the list? Well, one is you might get that knock on the door by a detective who has a letter with your name on it. You might get called into a community meeting with you and a bunch of your friends, kind of like this room, except there's a DA and a prosecutor who are basically going to do this scared straight lecture about why you need to turn your life around, and maybe there's some social services that could help you. Or it might just be the fact that you are scored. Everyone in Chicago now has a score from 1 to 500. Literally, when you get pulled over on the dashboard computer of that squad car, there's a number that pops up, 482, or whatever it would be, from 1 to 500. And officers are clearly going to respond to your potential threat, even though you might be a victim, based on this score. How they treat you, how the suspicion is created, but even more like whether they handcuff you, whether they're scared of you, whether they treat you with respect is all going to be determined in part by this score. Do we know what the black data problems are? Transparency. Do we know anything about the algorithm? Nope, they're keeping it secret. Do we know whether it has a racial impact? Yep, it does. The vast majority of people are young people of color in Chicago. I think it's something like 56% of all 20 to 29-year-old African-American men in Chicago have a heightened threat score. It's crazy numbers, right? And it's distorting, right? It distorts how officers see the communities, about how they're patrolling, and how they see these people, because now they are threats. Now they're scored. Now they are numbers and not people. And it changes things, right? And so these are problems that were not asked, or questions that were not really asked before the rollout. This is not an experiment that Chicago is realizing is a mistake. Instead, last week they basically tripled down on it. They just hired 86 new officers to sort of roll out these programs even more, do it at a local level. And it's part of what they think is working. You asked if there's a Chicago, district commander in this room. They say, like, yeah, Professor Ferguson, but it works. So tell me why we shouldn't do it. And that's the tension. That's the hard part of these debates about big data policing.
Can I ask one other question about your book, which is the other concept you talk about is blue data. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. So in the book, I play around with this idea of what happens if you turn this architecture of surveillance that we have built for civilians on police, right? We have predictive analytics that can predict who might be involved in a crime, but those same predictive analytics can be involved to say which officers might be more at risk for being involved in violent incidents. And in fact, there have been data scientists who have gone down, like in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, there's data science out of Chicago, went down to Charlotte-Mecklenburg, given almost complete access to all the data. They didn't know what they were going to find, but they could find some points of comparison. So, for example, one of the triggers for why there might be an act of violence was when an officer saw a traumatic, had a traumatic call for service. So maybe it's a suicide or a child death. The next shift, that officer is more likely to be involved in a violent incident. Why? Because that officer is human, right? He just saw something traumatic and horrible, and he's still processing. So you put him in a scary experience, it's going to go bad, and it did go bad. They're able to put that out as a way. Same thing, Jennifer Eberhard in Oakland, right near here, a Stanford researcher, went through and did the audio of the police body cams, right, that police are videotaped, but they're also talking to people. And so she was able to, she and her researchers were able to determine whether officers talk to different people of different races differently. And not surprisingly, they did, whereas they could even predict whether the officer was talking to a black person or a white person based on the sort of signs of respect. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. The apology, sorry for stopping you, and all these things that were there. And they could see that this is probably a good way to retrain officers, right? This is something that you could teach people. This is a data mining task that could actually help officers train and treat their communities in different ways by just studying the data. And all of these technologies are such that can be turned to sort of improve police accountability and training. We were getting one more. Okay, one more question, then we're going to open it up. So the central question of your paper and your research is that there is this undemocratic element, right? That happens through procurement. No one's paying attention. People aren't necessarily involved in surveillance technology. So who is the best person? Who is the best entity to respond to this undemocratic element?
I think that's a hard question. Because places like Oakland will solve the problem, I think, themselves, right? Now that the public has cottoned on that there is something that ought to be done. There's just not that many places, though, right, where you will get large numbers of citizens willing to come sit in public meeting rooms at 5 p.m. on a Thursday, month after month, to deal with this, right? So I'm both really impressed by what's happening in Oakland, and then also just a little depressed about how much work and effort it takes. So I think local solutions will only go so far. But then the question is, where does it go from there? So you could actually imagine a state requiring local police departments, if they acquired surveillance technology, to have use policies in place and to have model use policies. And often legislative advocacy campaigns begin with a few localities doing something. Then you get one police department that's willing to say, yes, we have this policy in place, but it's fine, right? We can still police effectively. And then you get to have a little bit more of a movement. So I think we're at the beginning of figuring out how to deal with this. And so it's just going to take some time. One of the things I think is also true is that local governments are just waking up to the fact that they're all data stewards now. About a year ago, I was on a panel together with the taxi commissioner in New York City, and they were collecting very specific GPS information of where rides started and stopped, and just hadn't occurred to them there was a privacy problem, or that they were data managers, because previously all of this stuff had been written down on paper, right? And so I do think some of this is just growing pains, and we'll get better at it over time. So, should we do questions from?
So we've got time for about 10 minutes of questions.
Thank you both very much. It's very interesting. My name is David Skinner from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And while I think it's important, these topics are very important, I wanted to try to join them maybe a little bit with what I would call related issues in asymmetric technology transfer. That is that these techniques, particularly in using large-scale data and processing, are not evenly accessible, as you've pointed out, in a variety of ways. And that I think that tells us something about how long it's going to get people to understand the algorithm, right? Or to understand algorithms really in general at all. And transparency and things like that are some good guiding principles. But even within the physical quantitative sciences, the level of rigor with p-values or analysis of variance, there's quite a bit of variability there too. So it's a big ask on the public to come up to speed on that. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the local approaches that you're suggesting, I think, could be very, very interesting. Have you considered analogs in spaces such as community decision-making about energy, which is a positive direction but could perhaps bring people in a similar direction to understanding the value of their data?
Thanks for that. I guess I'll just talk about the second one. I love the idea of looking at analogs like community decisions about energy, and I'd love to know more about that. I haven't focused on that so far. My work now is looking at regional data sharing, which I think is in some ways an even more complicated problem, because then the data gets shared not just with the local police department. The data isn't just in the possession of the local police department, which is just very obviously accountable to the city council, but it's caught up in these broader structures. And so I do think we need models from other areas to try to figure out how to do that in some kind of transparent, accountable, and democratic way.
I'll just keep this quick. I think you're exactly right that the transparency battle is that we are not conversant as a society in technology, and even more fundamentally, we're not even aware of the surveillance technology that's out there, right? People aren't even getting to that second level of how do we understand it because they don't even know what's happening. This is a enlightened community that actually is having these debates, but the vast majority of Americans are not, and the technology is coming.
Thank you both for being here. I am in a group project right now where we are trying to communicate to a local government the importance of prioritizing data management, privacy concerns, and security concerns as they're implementing IoT technology. I'm curious what your findings have been about the best ways to communicate that when they are very excited about moving forward with IoT or other surveillance-related technology, and don't want to sort of squash their excitement while still communicating the concern.
Obviously, they should all read my book. But then after that, no, I think it's a real concern, in part because a lot of the IT technology is actually being given to cities. Like that, they'll say, "Hey, we'll give you this for free." And again, the lesson being that if someone's giving you it for free, like you're the product, and you got to realize that your citizens are now the product, and who's controlling that data, who owns the data, how is it going to be shared, and how is the privacy going to be kept? It's a big issue. I sort of write about in a couple of law review articles about the Fourth Amendment and the Internet of Things. Like, how do you figure out this space of what is the information coming from that smart heart stent out to the world, or that smart car? Like, how do you put that into an old-fashioned technology? But they're all unanswered questions. And my real concern, this is the funny piece of a lot of this, is that answer is going to come down to like the city lawyers who have to write the contracts with these companies. And if they're not careful, they're about to give up a ton of really personal information without any sort of compensation or thought about it. And it's strange that sometimes like the most fundamental liberties get reduced to like the city government lawyers who are not tech people. They are there because they did contracting and that's their world. But they need to get up to speed because it's a really critical issue.
So I dealt with that just a little bit. And I say first, always acknowledging that the city has a real need, right? I'm always struck when I talk to people from cities just how few resources they have, right? And so they're not trying, they're good actors, right? They're trying to do something great. And then pointing out that, the world is littered with projects, municipal projects that died because privacy concerns weren't adequately considered, right? So for transportation policy in particular is just like a graveyard of failed initiatives, because it turns out people actually, they're happy to geo-track themselves with their phones, but they don't want to often be geo-tracked with cities. So I think they're tactics for dealing with that.
We're going to move to a quick lightning round, get a few more questions on the table, and then I'll give you each just a minute to respond. So if you could keep them brief, that'd be great.
I just looked on my phone and I couldn't find this article from several years ago. It was by a Texas mathematician who looked at the things that TSA look for to find a, quote, terrorist. And the crux of it was that if you pick someone out of the line at random, you had a better chance of finding a terrorist than using their methodology. And that just imposed on me the framework of the, kind of like the double-blind study where you've got this black box. And I guess my question is there ever any pressure, or has it ever been done where they do a test of, well, cops say, yes, go to West Oakland for the crime, and then they find crime. What a big surprise. Well, what if we picked a spot in Oakland at random to see, are we going to find crime at the same level or more? Like, is there any kind of intellectually honest way rather than just we looked for it and we found it?
I'll try. Really hard to get to. Well, they can't hear you on the stream.
So my question has to do with preemption. Specifically like predictive policing, predictive analytics, and the basic question is this a worrying trend? Is this something we should really be worried about? Is it perhaps overblown? So I'll just give you two examples real quick. Louisa Moore, for example, has written about how people are being arrested when it comes to border control before they've actually committed any crime. So you mentioned that you corrected the video and said people aren't being arrested, in cities, citizens aren't being arrested, but people who are, not citizens of this country. Another example would be Minority Report. It's like a cultural touchstone. So I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Last question and then final remarks. Would you mind passing this down here, please?
Okay, so.
It's just for the live stream. You can't turn it on.
Okay, so thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I will be quick. I'm wondering what can we learn from cybersecurity regulation. You mentioned procurement. So there, for example, the IoT bill that actually mandates certain sets of clauses in contracts for IoT devices. And it seems like some of the struggles are interconnected. For example, how do we increase education with consumers and consumer advocacy? And how do we increase market reputational mechanisms? The second question is, can we rely on counter technology? For example, encryption, Signal, WhatsApp, etc., and how they were instrumental in free speech activities, etc.
Some very simple questions for you to wrap on, huh?
So starting with the last one first, is I think that it's exactly why these kinds of interrelated subjects matter, about why we're talking here, because I think there are lessons to be learned. I think that there really are lessons that we can learn from other technological adoptions here. But there are real difficulties with policing that's different. So there are two questions about the border. I think that one of the realities we're going to see in the very near future, because we've seen in the last couple of months, is that this world of big data policing, which has so far been a local story, is about to become federalized with the targeting of people who are quote unquote here illegally. And I think that we've started to see it. This federal government has rolled out automated license plate reader sort of contracts with Vigilant. They've done facial recognition scans, things we haven't seen the federal government do before. They're starting to do with the othering of people here who are not here legally. As to the question of, are there studies being done? There have been some studies being done. So, for example, for place-based predictive policing, there's been some studies to see if Predpol, which is one of the companies, was better than crime analysts. And it was a study funded by this company, Predpol, so they said it was. I think I take it with a grain of salt, but they also did find that their technology was better than the crime analysts. Now, of course, crime analysts themselves aren't validated, so we don't know if that's any good. But there have been studies that have shown some benefits, and there have been some studies, like RAND has done 2 studies, that show there aren't any benefits to these technologies. So there's room for researchers out there to do more studies, because we do need to know the answer, but we don't have a clear answer yet.
Any final words? Fantastic. I just heard the bell, so we're right on time. First and foremost, I want to thank our speakers. This was a wonderful and engaging discussion. We have a couple little gifts for you from CLTC, so thank you so much. I also want to say happy International Women's Day and also happy Big Give Day. So both the School of Information and CLTC are listed. So if you're interested in giving a gift so that we can continue to do programming like this, of course, we'd very much appreciate it. Finally, thank you to you all for being here. Please let's give our speakers one final round of applause.